Now that we've built our button event to control the switcher, we need to learn how to parse the incoming string and then send that information back to the variable text button on our touch panel. We'll start by setting up a data event for this device. Next, we'll need to add in the string handler in order to process the received data. Utilizing our string manipulation keywords, we first want to make sure we have a valid string. If we look at our protocol, we will notice that every string of data that is received from this device is exactly 8 bytes. So we could look for a string containing exactly 8 bytes using a conditional statement. If length string data.text double equals 8. Now we know this is in fact an 8-byte string. Inside this if statement is where we'll parse the string. We are interested in just the input number and the output number. Using the manipulation keyword midstring, I can extract the value and do a conditional on that value and execute an action. Let's create a local variable character array called stemp_buffer to store the string data so we can see what comes back to us in debug. The reason for this is to make troubleshooting easier when testing the logic of the programming. We'll also create 2 single integers to store the input number and the output number. Another way to make the code more reliable is to check to ensure the string is valid before we start parsing it. That's where findString comes in, since we already know that if the switcher sends us an acknowledge, the last character will always be a T. So we just use findString and look to see if the last character is in fact a T, and if it is, we parse the string. Now we need to load the input and output numbers into our variables. The easiest way to parse out these 2 values, since we know exactly where in the string they appear, is to use midstring like this. N input num gets A2I midstring temp buffer, comma 5, comma 1, and N output num gets A2I midstring temp buffer, comma 7, comma 1. We use those values because the input number is in the 5th element of the array and the output number is held in the 7th element of the array. We'll use 1 for the 3rd parameter because we only want to extract 1 character out of the array. Next, we can actually use those values to tell the user what just got routed and display the text in the following format on the touch panel. Input X routed to output Y. So let's write that send command to the touch panel. You may be wondering, where did I come up with the txt command? Well, that is the command to send variable text to the touch panel. The 10 is referencing the address code we used for that button on our pop-up page. The 0 is referring to the state of the button in which the text will appear. A 0 will send it to both the on and the off state. If we put a 1 there, that is only the off state, and a value of 2 would be the on state. You can find this command in AMXPI. Look at the send commands for our touch panel. That's it for our data event. Now, when you perform a route, the command will get sent to the switcher. If it executes, it will send a string back to the control system. The data event will parse the string and send a message to our button, confirming which input got routed to which output. There's one more thing I'd like to do. The input, output, and take buttons on the touch panel don't have any feedback associated with them at this point. Therefore, we have no indication that the buttons were even pressed. We'll start with the easiest one, the take button. Scroll back up to the button event. Since this button is a momentary push, I'm just going to add a to statement for button.input. When the take button gets pressed. That's it. Now let's deal with the input and output buttons. Luckily enough, we've already created a variable that is being used to store the currently selected input and outputs. Let's simply add some feedback statements based on these variables. Scroll down to our feedback section. We'll add 4 statements for the inputs and 4 that deal with the outputs. The first one will read dvtp underscore video SWT, comma, 41, gets n selected input double equals 1. I'll copy and paste this 3 more times and change the touch panel channels to 42 through 44 and the selected inputs to 2 through 4. I'll do the same for the outputs, except I'll change the touch panel buttons to 51 through 54, and n selected input will become the n selected output. Now let's compile our code once again. Now, when an input button is pressed, it will light up. Then, if you press the output button, it will also light up. But what happens when the take button is pressed? The buttons will stay lit. To fix this, go back up to the button event. This is very easy. When the take button gets pressed, let's reset the variables back to 0 now. The buttons will go off as soon as the take button is pressed. We're just about done. I want to do one more thing though. In the very last lesson, we learned about timelines. We had you build a timeline for feedback in your exercise code. Since that is the best practice, I want to move all of our feedback in this code into the feedback timeline of its own. I'm going to do this very quickly, since we just covered this. In the define constant section, I'll give our timeline an ID. I'll call it TL feedback, and it gets an ID of 7. In the define variable section, I'll create the array of times. I'll name it L feedback time, and the time I'll use will be 100 milliseconds. Now I'll create the timeline in define program. Timeline create. The timeline ID, TL feedback, followed by the times array, L feedback time. Then I'll use length array for the L feedback time array. And finally, I'll set it to timeline absolute and timeline repeat. The last thing to do is create the timeline event. I'll scroll all the way down and write the timeline event for the TL feedback ID. Inside the timeline, I'm just going to copy and paste all my feedback statements from define program. I'll comment out all of the code that exists in define program, and we're done. Once again, make sure you compile your code before moving on to the strings exercise.